The courtroom felt like a world far bigger than the 9-year-old boy himself. Every polished wooden bench and towering ceiling amplifying the weight of the moment. He shifted nervously on the edge of the witness stand, his small hands clutching his mother's, trying to draw strength from the warmth and reassurance she offered. The oversized blazer he wore hung awkwardly on his slender frame, sleeves brushing against his knuckles, but he refused to fidget, determined to appear as composed as possible. Around him the room hummed with impatience. Lawyers whispered behind folded hands, reporters scribbled in their notepads, and the gallery murmured quietly, casting glances that mixed curiosity with mild amusement. The judge, an imposing figure with graying hair and sharp eyes, leaned back in his chair regarding the boy with skepticism. "Do you even understand what you're saying?" he asked, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. A ripple of soft laughter moved through the room, the kind that underestimated the child sitting before them. The boy's stomach tightened. He had anticipated doubt, ridicule even, but the way the courtroom seemed to belittle him stung. Still, he took a deep breath and reminded himself of the countless nights spent hunched over legal books, scribbling notes and memorizing statutes. He had learned the language of the law, not just in theory, but in the meticulous way cases unfolded in courtrooms like this one. He glanced at his mother, her face pale but resolute, eyes wide with worry and hope intertwined. She had always been the backbone of their small household, working long shifts to provide for him. Yet tonight, he could be the one to protect her. That thought steadied his hands and sharpened his focus. The boy lifted his chin slightly and spoke, his voice steady but soft, carefully choosing words he had practiced, letting logic guide each sentence. The murmurs in the courtroom didn't bother him anymore. He could see the faint crease forming between the judge's brows as the first signs of interest replaced skepticism. The prosecutor leaned back, raising an eyebrow, clearly expecting the child to falter. Others in the room shifted in their seats, some with barely concealed smiles, thinking the boy's participation was more novelty than substance. Yet behind his eyes burned a quiet determination. He had spent nights learning the intricacies of laws that even adults struggled to navigate. And now, he would use that knowledge to safeguard his mother. He straightened, his small frame radiating a confidence far beyond his years, and began to outline the points he had memorized, weaving together logic, evidence, and legal precedent. The laughter that had filled the room earlier faded slowly, replaced by hushed whispers and sideways glances. The boy's mind, sharp and unyielding, began to carve a path through the skepticism, laying the groundwork for a courtroom that would soon realize that underestimating him had been their first mistake. As he spoke, he didn't just defend his mother. He silently announced that he was more than just a child in a blazer. He was a legal mind ready to be taken seriously, and the court would have to listen. The courtroom, once dismissive, began to shift its energy. The boy's gaze met his mother's again, and she offered the tiniest nod, a signal of faith that strengthened him. For the first time in the long, tense morning, he felt a surge of calm certainty. He was ready. The prosecutor leaned forward, a condescending smile playing at the edges of his mouth, as if expecting the boy to stumble over his own words. "So tell me," he began, "how exactly do you think you can help your mother? You're just a child." A few lawyers chuckled quietly, the sound echoing through the courtroom, and even a couple of spectators smirked, convinced that this was going to be an amusing moment. The boy's stomach twisted briefly, but he clenched his fists under the table, refusing to show the slightest tremor. He had prepared for exactly this. He had anticipated disbelief, mockery, even outright dismissal. His mind, sharp and precise, had replayed this scenario countless times. He opened his mouth and spoke slowly at first, letting each word land with deliberate care. "Your Honor, if I may," he said, and the judge leaned in, slightly curious despite himself. "There are procedural errors in the way the charges were filed. My mother's rights under the Constitution were not properly observed, and certain evidence should not have been allowed in this case." The words were small but carried the weight of careful reasoning, and he followed each with a clear citation of relevant statutes and case law, the result of late nights spent studying dusty legal texts and memorizing precedents that even many lawyers overlooked. At first, the courtroom's laughter had been polite, almost playful, but as the boy continued, those chuckles faltered. Whispers replaced the amusement as people began to realize he wasn't fumbling, wasn't being cute. He was making coherent, legally sound arguments. The prosecutor's smirk faded into a wary frown as he tried to interrupt. only to be silenced by the boy's calm insistence. "If I may finish," he said firmly, and the room fell quiet. Each point he made was methodical. He identified violations in procedure, noted inconsistencies in witness testimony, and even highlighted overlooked clauses that strengthened his mother's defense. His mother's hand trembled in her own as she watched him work. She had always known her son was intelligent, but seeing him stand in a courtroom, his small frame holding the attention of adults who had openly mocked him, filled her with awe and relief. Every argument he made was precise, every citation relevant, and every rebuttal punctuated with the confidence of someone who had spent years preparing for this exact moment, even if he had only lived 9 short years. The gallery, once filled with smirks, now leaned forward, captivated. Reporters scribbled furiously, sensing the unfolding story that defied expectations. Lawyers exchanged nervous glances, some clearly impressed, others frustrated at being outmaneuvered by a child. The judge's initial amusement had shifted into a measured, attentive scrutiny, his eyes fixed on the boy as he laid out his case with the poise of a seasoned attorney. By the time he concluded his first set of arguments, the courtroom atmosphere had transformed completely. There was no laughter left, only a tense, almost reverent silence, as if everyone present understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. The boy had not only defended his mother's rights, but had done so in a way that left the adults in the room reconsidering their assumptions. For the first time that day, he allowed himself a small private smile, knowing he had planted the seeds of respect in a courtroom that had doubted him from the start. The judge cleared his throat and tapped the gavel lightly, calling for order. The courtroom had fallen into a tense silence, the earlier murmurs and skeptical glances replaced by an air of anticipation. "Young man, continue," the judge said, his tone more measured now, tinged with curiosity rather than amusement. The boy straightened in his chair, his small frame seeming even more determined against the imposing backdrop of the courtroom. He took a deep breath, letting the familiar rhythm of logic and legal reasoning guide him, and focused on the next phase of his argument. He explained with surprising clarity and precision the specific procedural errors that had jeopardized his mother's case. He highlighted misfiled documents, improperly collected evidence, and violations of protocol that should have immediately rendered key accusations invalid. Each point he made was backed by citations he had memorized, case law he had studied, and constitutional clauses that even some of the adults in the room had overlooked. He moved deliberately from one argument to the next, weaving them into a cohesive narrative that clearly demonstrated the injustice his mother faced. The opposing counsel tried to interrupt him several times, his frustration growing with each precise rebuttal, but the boy calmly addressed every objection before they even had a chance to take hold, using the courtroom's own rules to reinforce his position. Every citation, every logical step was delivered with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent countless nights analyzing and rehearsing. There was no hesitation, no faltering, only a steady stream of evidence-based reasoning that left little room for counter-argument. The gallery watched in growing awe. Lawyers whispered among themselves, some impressed, some visibly shaken by the child's understanding of law that surpassed expectations. Reporters jotted down notes furiously, realizing they were witnessing something unprecedented. A 9-year-old not merely speaking in a courtroom, but directing it with the precision of a seasoned attorney. Even the judge, initially skeptical, leaned forward, reading the boy's documents carefully and occasionally nodding as he absorbed the depth of the arguments presented. The boy paused briefly, scanning the room, and his eyes met his mother's. She sat upright, hands folded tightly in her lap, trying to hide the tears that threatened to spill. She had always known her son was brilliant, but seeing him articulate complex legal principles with such authority left her breathless. Her pride was mixed with relief. The fear that had gripped her for weeks began to loosen, replaced by a cautious optimism that maybe, just maybe, they could win this fight, he resumed, now tackling the weaknesses in the prosecution's case with meticulous care. Each flaw he identified was explained in terms simple enough for anyone to understand, yet technically accurate enough to carry weight in the legal proceedings. By the time he concluded this portion of his argument, the courtroom had shifted entirely. The laughter was gone, the smirks replaced with focused attention. Every adult in that room had been forced to reconsider their assumptions, their disbelief challenged by the undeniable intellect and determination of a child who refused to be underestimated. The boy's words had not only defended his mother, they had changed the energy of the courtroom. The adults who had laughed now leaned in, listening intently, realizing that the case they had thought trivialized by a child's presence was now being examined with unmatched clarity and insight. And in that moment the boy felt a quiet surge of pride, knowing he was not just fighting for his mother, but commanding the respect that had been denied him from the start. By mid-afternoon, the atmosphere in the courtroom had transformed completely. The earlier skepticism and laughter had evaporated, replaced by an almost reverent tension. Every person present, from the seasoned attorneys to the jury members, leaned forward slightly, captivated by the precision and depth of the boy's arguments. He had moved beyond simply defending his mother. He was now systematically dismantling the weaknesses in the prosecution's case, exposing gaps and contradictions that no adult had noticed before. His voice remained steady, calm and measured, each word deliberate, carrying the weight of someone far older and far more experienced than his 9 years suggested. The prosecutors, who had once smiled condescendingly, now shifted uneasily in their seats. They whispered to one another, clearly realizing that underestimating the boy had been a grave mistake. Every time they attempted to interject, he anticipated their arguments, citing relevant statutes, procedural rules, and prior case law with uncanny accuracy. The courtroom was no longer a place where a child was being humorously humored. It had become a stage where intellect and logic ruled, regardless of age. Each of his points was delivered with a clarity that even seasoned lawyers struggled to match, and his reasoning was airtight, leaving little room for rebuttal. The judge, who had initially dismissed him as a novelty, now regarded the boy with serious attention. His eyes followed every movement, every citation, every nuanced argument. Occasionally, he paused to consult his notes, clearly impressed by the depth of knowledge displayed. The courtroom had shifted from mockery to quiet admiration. Whispers of astonishment spread like a gentle wave, replacing the earlier chuckles. Reporters scribbled furiously, realizing they were witnessing an extraordinary story unfold, a story of a child whose mind had already begun to master the complexities of law. The boy's mother watched him with a mixture of awe and relief. Her hands, previously trembling, were now clasped tightly together, and tears threatened to spill as she absorbed the reality of what her son was accomplishing. She had always known he was exceptionally intelligent, but to see him command respect and attention in a courtroom that had once doubted him left her overwhelmed. Every carefully constructed argument, every strategic observation was a testament to his diligence, his dedication, and his unwavering desire to protect her. As the boy continued, he navigated through the final intricacies of the case, identifying overlooked evidence and pointing out procedural violations with the precision of a seasoned litigator. The jurors shifted in their seats, some nodding subtly, others scribbling notes. Even the most skeptical attorneys could no longer dismiss him. They had been forced to engage with his reasoning on its merits. When he finally paused, a hush settled over the room. The boy's presence had altered the dynamics entirely. He had turned a courtroom that once laughed at him into a room that listened intently, analyzed carefully, and respected the intellect and courage of a child who refused to be underestimated. And in that moment he glanced at his mother again, offering her a small, reassuring smile. She returned it, pride and gratitude shining in her eyes, knowing that the fight they had feared for so long was no longer theirs alone. Her son had taken the lead, and he had done so brilliantly. The tension in the room eased slightly, replaced with a sense of anticipation. Everyone present understood that the tide had shifted, and the boy had become the center of a courtroom that could no longer ignore his brilliance. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that carried the weight of anticipation and awe. After hours of precise arguments, careful citations, and methodical dismantling of the prosecution's case, the moment of reckoning had arrived. The judge leaned forward slightly, his hands folded over the gavel, eyes scanning the room with measured attention. Even the lawyers who had initially dismissed the boy as a novelty were now visibly tense, aware that the outcome hinged on the points he had raised. The jury sat in thoughtful silence, each member reflecting on the clear, logical path the boy had laid before them. The boy's mother gripped his hand tightly, her knuckles white. She could hardly believe what she had witnessed. Her 9-year-old son, a child she had once quietly marveled at for his intelligence, had just held a courtroom in the palm of his hand. Tears threatened to spill, but she fought them back, knowing that her presence had to remain composed for him. Her heart pounded as she watched the judge prepare to deliver the verdict. The weight of justice finally about to tip in their favor. After reviewing the evidence, the arguments presented, and the procedural irregularities identified, the judge began, his voice calm but carrying the gravity of the moment. This court finds that the charges against Ms. Harper are invalid and must be dismissed. A collective gasp swept through the room, followed by murmurs of disbelief and admiration. Some lawyers shook their heads, muttering under their breath about the extraordinary turn of events, while jurors exchanged glances, impressed by the sheer competence of the child who had dominated the proceedings. The boy's mother hugged him tightly, her relief spilling over into tears. She whispered words of gratitude and pride, her voice choked with emotion. "You did it," she said over and over, as if repeating it could make the moment more real. The boy smiled, small but victorious, knowing that every late night spent poring over law books, every carefully memorized statute, and every calculated argument had led to this moment. He had not only defended his mother, he had done so with a brilliance that left the courtroom forever changed. Lawyers approached to shake his hand, some with smiles of genuine respect, others still processing the fact that they had been outmaneuvered by a 9-year-old. The judge offered a rare, warm smile and nodded in acknowledgement of the boy's exceptional reasoning, a subtle but unmistakable gesture of approval. Reporters scribbled furiously, already planning headlines that would capture the astonishing story of the young legal prodigy who had turned ridicule into triumph. Outside the courthouse, the scene was chaotic in a good way. Flashbulbs popped, people whispered excitedly, and the boy and his mother were surrounded by well-wishers who marveled at the story they had just witnessed. The boy, quiet but proud, held his mother's hand as they walked through the crowd, his small stature belying the incredible impact he had just made. For him, the victory was more than just a legal triumph. It was proof that intelligence, courage, and determination could overcome even the deepest doubts. That day, a courtroom that had laughed at a child learned a powerful lesson. Underestimating him had been the gravest mistake they could have made, and justice, guided by his mind, had prevailed.